A young billionaire stepped onto a city bus one quiet morning, and two little girls changed the course of his life forever. They were poor, their clothes worn and their eyes red from crying. In their small hands they held a cardboard sign that read, "Help us save our mommy." Most people looked away. Some gave a few coins. But when the billionaire leaned closer and saw the photograph taped to that sign, his entire world stopped. Because the woman in that photo was someone he knew, someone he had once turned his back on. And in that moment, the richest man on that bus realized a painful truth. Sometimes the greatest debt in life can't be paid with money. If stories about family, kindness, and second chances mean something to you, take a moment to subscribe and stay with us. Because some stories don't just entertain, they remind us what it means to be human. Colt Harland stood in front of the massive window of his penthouse, staring out at the Manhattan skyline as the first light of dawn painted the buildings in shades of gold and orange. To most people, the view was breathtaking. To Colt, it was routine. At 28 years old, Colt was already one of the most successful CEOs in America. His company, Harland Enterprises, had grown into a billion-dollar empire. Business magazines called him a prodigy. Financial analysts called him unstoppable. And people who worked for him often called him something else, cold. His life moved like clockwork. Wake up at 5. Exercise. Shower. Coffee. Meetings. Deals. Numbers. Strategy. No wasted time. No distractions. Colt adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt and studied his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His gray-blue eyes looked calm, almost distant. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw cleanly shaved. A face that had appeared on magazine covers many times, but rarely smiling. For Colt, emotions were inefficient. Feelings complicated decisions. And in his world, decisions needed to be sharp, precise, and logical. Yet that morning, something felt off. He couldn't explain it. It was like a quiet restlessness sitting somewhere deep in his chest. He had slept exactly 7 hours, just like every night. His calendar was perfectly organized. His business deals were on track. Still, the strange feeling wouldn't go away. A voice came through the intercom in the hallway. "Mr. Harland, your coffee is ready. The car is waiting downstairs." It was Reynolds, his assistant of 3 years. Colt hesitated. Then he pressed the intercom button. "Cancel the car today." There was silence. "Sir, cancel the car?" "Yes." Another pause. "Is there a change in your schedule?" "No. I just won't be using the car." Reynolds didn't argue, but Colt could almost hear the confusion through the speaker. For 3 years, Colt Harland had never changed his routine. Not once. Colt turned off the intercom before any more questions could follow. He wasn't even sure why he had said it. All he knew was that the city outside suddenly felt closer, more alive. He grabbed a casual jacket from the back of his closet, something he almost never wore, and headed downstairs. The doorman looked surprised when Colt walked past the private garage entrance. "Good morning, Mr. Harland. Should I call a cab?" "No, thank you," Colt replied calmly. The autumn air hit his face as he stepped onto the street. New York was already awake. People hurried along the sidewalks with coffee cups in their hands. Taxis honked. Shop owners rolled up metal gates. The smell of fresh bagels drifted from a corner cafe. For a moment, Colt simply stood there watching. How many times had he passed this street without actually seeing it? Without thinking too much, he started walking. 1 block. Then another. Then another. Eventually, he reached a small bus stop where a handful of people stood waiting. A city bus approached with a loud hiss of brakes. Colt looked at it. He couldn't even remember the last time he had ridden one. Probably before college. Before his first company. before his first $1,000,000. Something inside him nudged him forward. When the doors opened, Colt stepped inside. The driver glanced at him. $3. Colt blinked for a moment before pulling out his wallet and handing the man a $20 bill. "Keep the change." The driver stared at him, surprised, but shrugged and waved him through. Colt walked down the aisle while several passengers glanced up at him. It wasn't hard to notice him. His suit alone probably cost more than most people on the bus earned in a week. He took a seat near the back and looked out the window as the bus pulled away. The ride was noisy, a little cramped, but strangely real. An old woman clutched grocery bags across the aisle. A teenager bobbed his head to music through cheap headphones. A tired man flipped through a newspaper. Ordinary lives. Lives Colt rarely saw up close. The bus rolled through Manhattan and eventually crossed into Queens. Nearly 30 minutes passed. Then, at one stop, 3 new passengers climbed aboard. 2 little girls, and an elderly woman. Colt barely noticed them at first, until he saw the sign. It was made from a piece of cardboard with colorful, uneven letters clearly written by a child. The older girl held it tightly in both hands. The message was simple. "Help US save our mommy." Colt frowned slightly. The girl couldn't have been older than 5. She had curly blonde hair and big tired eyes. The younger one, maybe 4 years old, clung to her sister's hand. They sat a few rows ahead. Colt tried to look away, but he couldn't. The older girl whispered to the elderly woman beside them. "Grandma, how many people did we ask today?" The woman sighed softly. "Many, sweetheart. But we have to keep trying." The younger girl's voice trembled. "Mommy is going to get better, right?" The grandmother forced a small smile. "Yes, honey. We just need a little help." A moment later, the older girl stood up. Her small hands trembled, but she gathered her courage and began walking slowly down the aisle, holding up the sign. "Please, our mommy is very sick," she said softly. "We need money for medicine." Some passengers looked at her with sympathy. Others pretended not to see. When the little girl reached Colt's seat, she stopped. Her wide eyes met his. "Mister, can you help our mommy?" Colt slowly took the cardboard sign from her hands. That's when he noticed something taped to the corner. A small photograph. He leaned closer. And the moment he saw the woman in the picture, the color drained from his face. Because the sick mother those girls were begging to save was a woman Colt Harland had fired 8 months ago. Because the sick mother those girls were begging to save was a woman Colt Harland had fired 8 months ago. For a second, the sounds of the bus faded into a distant blur. Marianne Miller. The name echoed in his mind like a bell. He stared at the photograph again, making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. The woman in the picture was smiling, sitting on a park bench with the 2 girls beside her. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her eyes carried the same gentle warmth he remembered from years of quiet mornings in his penthouse kitchen. Marianne. The woman who had worked in his home for 4 years. The woman he had dismissed without hesitation. Colt slowly lifted his eyes toward the little girl standing in front of him. Is your mom's name Marianne?" he asked. His voice sounded strange even to himself. The girl nodded eagerly. "Yes. Marianne Miller. That's our mommy. Do you know her?" Colt felt something tighten in his chest. 4 years, he had made thousands of decisions in seconds. Contracts worth millions, company takeovers, investments that changed markets. But now, facing this tiny girl with hopeful eyes, he suddenly felt unsure of everything. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know her." The younger girl stepped closer, still holding onto her sister's sweater. "She's very sick," the little one said softly. She coughs all the time and she's really hot. She has a fever, the older girl corrected carefully, trying to sound grown-up. Colt swallowed. What's your name? He asked the older girl. Ellie. And her? My sister's Willer. Willer gave him a shy little wave. Colt glanced back at the photograph again. 8 months earlier, Marianne had stood in his office with her hands folded nervously in front of her. She had been late 3 times that week. And late employees were something Colt didn't tolerate. Not even once. He remembered her voice. Soft. Respectful. I'm sorry, Mr. Harland. I've been having some problems at home. But Colt had barely listened. He had already made up his mind. I can't run a company with unreliable staff, he had said coldly. You'll receive your final paycheck this week. That was it. 4 years of loyal work, ended in less than 3 minutes. Colt forced the memory away and looked back at Ellie. Where is your mom now? He asked. Ellie pointed toward the front of the bus where the elderly woman sat watching them. That's our Grandma Rosa. Mommy's at home. She's too weak to get out of bed. As if sensing they were being discussed, Rosa slowly stood up and walked toward them. Her tired eyes studied Colt carefully. The moment she recognized him, her expression hardened slightly. You're Colt Harland, she said. It wasn't a question. Colt nodded. Yes. Rosa crossed her arms. Marianne must have mentioned him before. I'm surprised to see you here, she said quietly. Colt didn't answer right away. The truth was, he was surprised too. I ran into the girls, he said simply. Ellie held the cardboard sign closer to him again. Mister, can you help our mommy? The question hung in the air. Around them, the bus continued its rattling journey through Queens. Passengers shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. The driver muttered something under his breath as traffic slowed. But for Colt, everything narrowed down to those 2 small faces. Hope, fear, trust. Rosa sighed softly. They've been doing this all morning, she explained. Walking around buses and subway stations asking people for help. Colt looked at her. What happened to Marianne? Rosa hesitated before answering. It started with a flu, she said. But she didn't get proper treatment. After she lost her job, she lost her health insurance too. Every word landed like a small stone in Colt's stomach. She kept working odd cleaning jobs, Rosa continued. But the cough got worse. Then the fever came. The doctor thinks it's pneumonia. Colt felt the weight of the photograph in his hand. Pneumonia. A treatable illness, if someone had money. How much do the medicines cost? He asked. Rosa gave a tired laugh. More than we have. Ellie tugged lightly at Colt's sleeve. Mommy tries to smile for us, she said softly. But sometimes she cries when she thinks we're asleep. The bus slowed to a stop. The doors opened with a hiss. Rosa glanced toward the exit. This is our stop. She took Ellie's hand and motioned for Willer to follow. But before they could step off the bus, Colt suddenly stood up. Wait. The word came out sharper than he expected. Rosa turned back. Yes. Colt hesitated. For most of his life, decisions had always been calculated. Logical. But this moment didn't feel logical. It felt human. Take me to her, he said. Rosa's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Because I want to help. There was a long pause. Years of struggle and disappointment had clearly taught Rosa to be careful with promises. You already helped once, she said quietly. Colt frowned. What do you mean? She looked him straight in the eyes. You helped when you fired her. The words struck like a slap. But Colt didn't argue. Because deep down, he knew she was right. Rosa studied his face for another moment. Then she sighed. "If you're serious," she said, "follow us." The three of them stepped off the bus. Cold autumn air wrapped around them as traffic rushed past. Colt stood there for a moment, looking down the quiet Queen Street. This neighborhood felt a world away from the glass towers of Manhattan. Old brick buildings, cracked sidewalks, small grocery stores with faded signs. Ellie looked up at him. "Our house is this way," she said, pointing down the block. Colt followed them silently, step by step, block by block, and with every step, a strange feeling grew heavier in his chest. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Guilt, hope, fear. Finally, Rosa stopped in front of a narrow brick building with peeling paint and a broken elevator sign taped beside the door. "We live on the 3rd floor," she said. Colt glanced up at the worn windows. Somewhere inside that building, a woman he had once dismissed like a minor inconvenience was now fighting to breathe. Rosa opened the door and started climbing the stairs. Ellie and Willer ran ahead excitedly. Colt followed slowly behind. And with every creaking step up those narrow stairs, he had the growing feeling that the moment he opened that apartment door, his life would never be the same again. The stairway smelled faintly of old paint and damp wood as Colt climbed behind Rosa. Each step creaked under his polished shoes, a sharp contrast to the quiet marble floors he was used to walking across in his penthouse. Ellie and Willer were already halfway up the stairs, their small footsteps quick and light. "Hurry!" Willer called softly, looking back with excitement. "Mommy will be happy." Ellie didn't say anything, but she glanced at Colt for a moment, studying him the way children sometimes do when they're trying to figure out whether an adult can be trusted. By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Colt's chest felt tight for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Rosa stopped in front of a narrow apartment door and pulled a small set of keys from her coat pocket. For a second, she hesitated. Then she unlocked it. The door creaked open slowly. A soft cough came from somewhere inside the apartment. Not a normal cough. A deep, painful one that sounded like it came from someone struggling to breathe. Ellie ran inside immediately. "Mommy, we're back." Willer followed right behind her. Colt stepped in last. The apartment was small. Not messy, but worn. The furniture had clearly seen many years of use. The couch near the window sagged slightly in the middle. A coffee table leaned unevenly on one leg that had been repaired with a stack of old books. Children's drawings covered the walls, bright crayon pictures of flowers, stick figure families, and houses with smiling suns in the corners. There were a few plants on the windowsill, their leaves drooping slightly but still alive. The place felt humble, but it also felt like a home. Another cough echoed from a bedroom down the short hallway. Ellie rushed toward the door. "Mommy, guess what? We met someone." Colt stopped in the living room, suddenly unsure if he should keep walking. Rosa passed him quietly and entered the bedroom. For a moment, everything went silent. Then Rosa's voice came gently from inside. "Marianne, you have a visitor." There was a pause. Then a weak voice answered. "Visitor?" Colt slowly walked down the hallway. When he reached the doorway, he froze. Marianne lay in a small bed near the window. A thin blanket covered her, but even from the doorway it was clear how much weight she had lost. Her face was pale except for the red flush of fever on her cheeks. Her dark hair, once always neatly tied back while she worked in Colt's penthouse kitchen, now rested loosely across the pillow. She looked fragile. Too fragile. The strong, quiet woman he remembered seemed to have faded into someone far weaker. Ellie climbed carefully onto the bed beside her. "Mommy, look. This man knows you." Marianne turned her head slowly. The moment her eyes met Colt's, they widened in disbelief. "Mr. Harland?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Colt felt something twist painfully in his chest. "Hello, Marianne." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Memories seemed to hang between them. Years of silent mornings in his kitchen. The quiet way she had cleaned his house, always careful not to disturb him. The day he had fired her without even asking about the problems she had mentioned. Marianne tried to push herself up slightly, but the effort triggered another violent cough. Rosa quickly moved closer. "Easy, sweetheart." Colt stepped forward instinctively. "You shouldn't move." Marianne finally managed to sit up slightly against the pillows, though it clearly took effort. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. Colt hesitated. "I met your daughters on the bus." Ellie nodded quickly. "We were showing people the sign." She held up the cardboard piece proudly. Marianne's eyes filled with sadness when she saw it. "I told you girls not to bother strangers." "We're not bothering," Willer protested gently. "We're helping you." Marianne looked toward Colt again. A quiet mixture of embarrassment and exhaustion crossed her face. "I'm sorry if they caused trouble." "They didn't," Colt said quickly. His voice came out softer than usual. "They asked for help." Another silence settled over the small room. Colt studied her carefully. "How long have you been sick?" "A while," Marianne admitted. "Why didn't you go to the hospital?" She gave a faint, tired smile. "Hospital bills don't disappear just because you're sick." Colt looked at Rosa. "Has she seen a doctor?" Rosa nodded slowly. "Once. The clinic said it's likely pneumonia." Ellie looked between the adults nervously. "What's pneumonia?" Marianne gently brushed Ellie's hair. "It just means Mommy needs medicine." "But we don't have enough money yet," Willer said quietly. Colt took a slow breath. His mind raced through everything Rosa had told him earlier. Lost job. Lost insurance. Working odd cleaning jobs while sick. And all of it traced back to the day he had dismissed her from his house like she was a replaceable piece of furniture. Marianne watched him carefully. "You didn't have to come here," she said after a moment. "I know," Colt replied. His voice was calm, but something deeper was moving inside him. "I came because I need to fix something." Rosa crossed her arms again. "Fix what?" Colt looked directly at Marianne. "This." He turned toward Rosa. "Call an ambulance." Rosa blinked. "What?" "She needs a hospital immediately." Marianne shook her head weakly. "No, we can't afford that." Colt's tone didn't change. "You're not paying for it." Marianne stared at him. "Mr. Harland, I can't accept." "Yes, you can." For the first time since entering the apartment, there was a firmness in Colt's voice. Not the cold authority he used in boardrooms. Something different. Something human. "You worked in my house for 4 years," he said quietly. "You took care of everything in my life." He paused. "And when you needed help, I didn't even listen." The room went silent. Even the girls stopped moving. Colt reached for his phone. "I'm calling an ambulance right now." Marianne looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion, gratitude, and something else, something fragile. Hope. But before Colt could dial the number, Marianne suddenly grabbed his wrist weakly. "Wait." Her voice trembled. "If you're going to do this." She hesitated, then asked the question that made Colt's heart sink. "Why now?" Marianne's fingers were weak, but the way she held Colt's wrist carried a quiet determination. "If you're going to do this, why now?" Her voice was fragile, almost breathless, but the question hung in the room like a weight. Colt looked down at her hand on his wrist. For a moment, he didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't simple. He could have said it was guilt. He could have said it was responsibility. He could have said it was the right thing to do. But standing there in that small bedroom, hearing her struggle just to breathe, none of those answers felt big enough. Finally, he spoke. "I saw your daughters on a bus this morning." Marianne's eyes moved slowly toward Ellie and Willer. They were asking strangers to help save their mommy. A faint shadow crossed her face. "I told them not to do that." Ellie looked down at her hands. "But we had to," she said quietly. "You were getting worse." Willer nodded quickly. "We didn't know what else to do." Marianne closed her eyes for a moment as if the words hurt more than the illness. When she opened them again, they rested on Colt. "So, you helped because you felt sorry for them?" Colt shook his head slowly. "No." He paused. "I helped because when I saw that sign, I realized something." The room was silent again. Colt's voice softened. "I realized I was the reason they needed it in the first place." Rosa shifted slightly by the doorway but didn't interrupt. Marianne studied Colt carefully, as if trying to decide whether his words were genuine or just another polite apology. But before she could say anything, another coughing fit hit her. This one was worse. Her body shook with the effort, and she pressed a trembling hand against her chest as she struggled to catch her breath. Ellie immediately grabbed her hand. "Mommy." Willer's eyes filled with fear. "Is she okay?" Colt didn't hesitate anymore. He gently freed his wrist and stepped back. "We're not waiting another minute." He dialed quickly. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. When he ended it, Rosa looked at him. "They're coming." "Yes." "How long?" 10 minutes. Marianne leaned back against the pillows, still breathing unevenly. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Colt met her eyes. "Yes, I did." Ellie squeezed her mother's hand. "See, Mommy? I told you someone would help." Marianne forced a faint smile for her daughters, but Colt could see the exhaustion behind it. She had been fighting this alone for far too long. The minutes passed slowly. Outside the apartment window, a distant siren eventually broke the quiet of the street. Willer's head popped up. "That's them." Ellie ran to the window. "They're here." The flashing lights reflected faintly across the walls of the small apartment. Rosa moved quickly to open the door. Two paramedics hurried inside carrying equipment. "What's the situation?" one of them asked. "Severe cough, high fever, likely pneumonia," Colt said calmly. The paramedics moved into the bedroom and began checking Marianne's pulse and oxygen levels. One of them looked up after a moment. "Her oxygen's low. She needs to go in right away." Marianne tried to protest weakly. I can walk." The paramedic shook his head gently. "Not today, ma'am." They carefully helped her onto a stretcher. Ellie and Willer watched with wide, worried eyes. "Where are they taking Mommy?" Willer whispered. "To the hospital," Colt said softly. "Is she going to be okay?" Colt knelt down so he was eye level with them. "The doctors are going to help her breathe better." Willer looked at him for a moment, studying his face carefully. Then she asked the question only a child could ask so simply. "Are you going to stay with us?" Colt didn't even think before answering. "Yes." The paramedics began rolling the stretcher toward the door. Ellie suddenly ran after them. "Wait!" She grabbed the edge of the stretcher gently. "Mommy, we're coming too." Marianne looked at Rosa. "Take care of them." But Colt stepped forward. "They're coming with us." Rosa blinked. "All of you?" "Yes." The paramedic nodded. "There's room." The ride down the narrow stairway was slow and careful. Outside, the ambulance waited with its back doors open. Cold air rushed through the street, carrying the distant hum of city traffic. Marianne was lifted inside. Ellie and Willer climbed in right after her. Colt followed and took a seat beside the girls as the doors closed. The ambulance began moving almost immediately. The inside filled with the quiet beeping of medical equipment and the steady hum of the engine. Ellie held her mother's hand while Willer leaned against Colt's arm. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The city lights flashed through the windows as they passed intersections and traffic signals. Finally, Ellie looked up at Colt. "Mister?" "You can call me Colt," he said gently. She nodded. "Colt, will the doctors really help Mommy?" He looked toward Marianne, who lay weak but conscious on the stretcher. Then back at the two little girls watching him with absolute trust. "Yes," he said. "We're going to get her the best doctors." The paramedic glanced briefly at Colt. "You family?" Colt hesitated for a moment. His old life would have answered differently. But now, something inside him had shifted. "Yes," he said quietly. The word felt unfamiliar, but strangely right. The ambulance sped through the streets toward the hospital. Inside, Ellie slowly rested her head against Colt's shoulder. Willer held onto his hand tightly. And for the first time in years, Colt Harlan didn't think about business deals, stock markets, or boardroom meetings. All he could think about was the fragile woman fighting to breathe a few feet away, and the two little girls who believed he could save her. But as the ambulance lights reflected across the dark city streets, Colt couldn't shake one quiet fear growing inside him. What if he had already arrived too late? The ambulance lights flashed across the hospital entrance as the vehicle slowed to a stop. The back doors swung open, and cool night air rushed inside. The paramedics moved quickly. "Let's go," one of them said as they rolled Marianne's stretcher down the ramp. Ellie and Willer climbed out carefully behind them. Colt stepped down last, staying close to the girls as they followed the stretcher through the automatic hospital doors. Inside, everything moved fast. Bright lights. Footsteps echoing down long hallways. Voices calling instructions. A nurse hurried over with a clipboard. "What do we have?" "Female, early 30s, the paramedic said while pushing the stretcher forward. "Severe pneumonia symptoms. High fever. Low oxygen." The nurse nodded and turned toward Colt. "Are you family?" Colt didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then we'll need you to fill out some forms." Ellie grabbed Colt's sleeve suddenly. "Where are they taking Mommy?" He crouched down beside her. "The doctors need to help her breathe better." "Can we stay with her?" Colt looked toward the nurses guiding the stretcher around a corner. "For a little while." Willer clutched his hand tighter. "I don't like hospitals." "That's okay," Colt said softly. "Most people don't." They followed the medical team into a treatment room where nurses quickly connected Marianne to monitors and oxygen. The room filled with quiet mechanical sounds. Beeping machines. Soft footsteps. A doctor entered moments later, scanning the monitor readings. "How long has she been sick?" he asked. Colt glanced briefly at Rose's empty place beside him, remembering she had stayed behind with the apartment. "A while," he said. "Too long." The doctor nodded and checked Marianne's breathing again. "We're running tests, but this does look like advanced pneumonia." Ellie squeezed Willer's hand nervously. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Colt didn't answer right away. The doctor spoke gently. "It means your mommy's lungs are very tired." Ellie looked at him with wide eyes. "But you're going to help her, right?" The doctor offered a calm smile. "That's exactly what we're here for." He turned back to Colt. "We'll need to admit her immediately. Antibiotics, oxygen support, and observation." "Do whatever you need," Colt said. The doctor studied him for a moment. "Treatment like this can be expensive." Colt's expression didn't change. That won't be a problem. The doctor nodded and signaled the nurses. Within minutes, Mary Ann was moved to a private room on the upper floor. Colt completed the paperwork at the nurses' station while Ellie and Willer sat quietly beside him. His phone buzzed constantly in his pocket. Calls from Reynolds. Messages from board members. Urgent emails. For the first time in years, Colt ignored every single one. A nurse approached after a while. "She's stable for now. You can come in." The girls stood up immediately. Inside the room, Mary Ann lay resting under clean white sheets. Tubes and wires connected to machines beside the bed, but the oxygen mask seemed to help her breathing slightly. Ellie walked over carefully. "Mommy." Mary Ann opened her eyes slowly. "There you are." Her voice sounded weaker, but calmer. Willer climbed onto the chair beside the bed. "Doctors are fixing you." Mary Ann smiled faintly. "I guess they are." Colt stayed near the doorway for a moment, watching the small family together. Then Ellie looked back at him. "Come here." He stepped closer. Mary Ann's eyes found his. "You didn't have to stay." Colt shook his head. "Yes, I did." The girls leaned over to kiss their mother gently. After a few minutes, the nurse returned. "I'm sorry, kids," she said softly. "Your mom needs to rest now." Ellie nodded, though it was clear she didn't want to leave. "Will you be here when we come back?" Mary Ann brushed her daughter's hair. "Of course." Colt led the girls out into the hallway where a row of chairs sat against the wall. Willer immediately leaned against him, clearly exhausted. "I'm tired." "You've had a big day," Colt said. Ellie sat beside them, swinging her feet quietly. For a while, none of them spoke. The hallway hummed with distant hospital activity. Doctors passing by. Phones ringing. Quiet conversations. Finally, Ellie looked up at Colt again. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried more sincerity than any praise Colt had received in boardrooms or press conferences. "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, we do," Willa said sleepily. "You saved Mommy." Colt felt a tight knot in his chest. "I'm just helping the doctors." Ellie studied him carefully. "Mommy always said you were very important." Colt raised an eyebrow slightly. "She said that?" Ellie nodded. "She said you were a very busy man." The words hit harder than the girl realized. Busy. That was the word people used when they didn't want to say something else. Cold. Distant. Unreachable. Colt leaned back in the chair. "How about we get you two something to eat?" he said after a moment. "I'm not hungry," Ellie replied. But Willa raised her hand slightly. "I am." Colt smiled faintly. "Then let's fix that." They walked down to the hospital cafeteria where the smell of warm food filled the air. Colt bought them sandwiches and juice. Willer ate happily, while Ellie mostly watched the hallway, clearly worried about her mother. After a while, Willer's eyes began to droop. "I'm sleepy." Colt checked the time. It was nearly midnight. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's sit back upstairs." They returned to the hallway outside Mary Ann's room. Within minutes, Willer had fallen asleep with her head resting on Colt's arm. Ellie leaned against the other side of him, fighting sleep. Colt sat there between the two girls, completely still. He looked through the glass window into the hospital room. Mary Ann slept quietly, the machines beside her blinking steadily. For the first time that day, Colt allowed himself to breathe. But just as his eyes began to close for a moment, the door to Mary Ann's room suddenly opened, and the doctor stepped out with a serious look on his face. The doctor stepped into the hallway and quietly closed the door behind him. Colt straightened in his chair. Ellie was half asleep against his shoulder, and Willer was fully asleep in his arms, her small fingers still curled around the sleeve of his jacket. The doctor looked down at the girls, then back at Colt. "Can we talk for a moment?" Colt nodded carefully and shifted slightly so he wouldn't wake them. "What's going on?" The doctor lowered his voice. "She's very sick." Colt had expected that answer, but hearing it still made something tighten inside him. "How bad?" The doctor folded his arms. "The pneumonia spread deeper into her lungs than we first thought. It looks like she's been sick for weeks without proper treatment." Colt glanced through the small window in the door at Mary Ann lying in the hospital bed. "She'll recover," he said quietly, almost like a statement rather than a question. The doctor paused. "With the right treatment, there's a strong chance." A strong chance. Not certainty. Colt felt Ellie shift slightly beside him. Her eyes opened slowly. "Is Mommy okay?" The doctor crouched down so he was closer to her level. "Your mommy is very strong," he said gently. "We're giving her medicine to help her lungs get better." Ellie nodded, accepting the answer the way children often do when they sense the truth but choose hope anyway. "Can we see her again?" "In the morning," the doctor said kindly. "Right now she needs to sleep." Ellie looked toward the door of the hospital room. Then back at Colt. "Can we stay here tonight?" Colt hesitated for a second, but the answer came naturally. "Yes." The doctor gave him a quick look. "You're staying with them?" "Yes." The doctor nodded slowly. "Well, she's lucky to have someone here for her." Colt almost said something, but the words stopped before they reached his mouth. Because the truth was, Mary Ann hadn't been lucky before today. The doctor stood up. "If there's any change in her condition, I'll come get you." Colt nodded. The hallway grew quiet again after the doctor walked away. Ellie leaned back against Colt's shoulder. "You're not leaving, right?" "No. Promise." "I promise." She relaxed slightly and closed her eyes again. Colt looked down at the two girls sleeping beside him. Willer's head rested against his arm, and Ellie's small hand still held onto the edge of his jacket as if letting go might make him disappear. The hospital lights above hummed softly. For years, Colt had spent nights like this in private jets, luxury hotels, and quiet penthouses overlooking the city. But this night felt completely different. Not comfortable. Not glamorous. Yet somehow, more real than anything he had experienced in years. His phone vibrated again in his pocket. He pulled it out quietly. 32 missed calls. Reynolds. Board members. Investors. The business world was probably in chaos trying to figure out where he had disappeared to. Colt stared at the screen for a moment. Then he turned the phone off. Across the hallway, a nurse noticed the girls sleeping beside him and approached with a soft smile. "They can use this." She placed a folded blanket over Willer and Ellie. "Thank you," Colt said quietly. The nurse nodded. "You're doing a good thing." Colt didn't respond, because part of him knew the truth. This wasn't just kindness. It was correction. A long overdue one. Hours passed slowly. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Willer shifted and opened her eyes. "Colt, I'm here. Is Mommy still sick?" "She's resting." Willer thought about that for a moment. Then she whispered something that made Colt's chest tighten again. "You know, Mommy prayed last night." "Prayed." Willer nodded sleepily. "She asked God to send someone to help us." Colt didn't know what to say. He had spent most of his life believing in hard work, strategy, and numbers. Faith wasn't something he had ever paid much attention to. But sitting in that hospital hallway, with a tired little girl leaning against him, the words stayed with him. Someone to help us. Eventually Willer fell asleep again. The first faint light of morning began to appear through the windows at the end of the hallway. A nurse changed shifts. Doctors walked past holding tablets and charts. Another long day inside the hospital was beginning. Ellie woke up slowly and rubbed her eyes. "Did Mommy wake up yet?" "Not yet," Colt said. "But she will." They waited another hour before the doctor returned. "Good morning," he said. "Can we see her now?" Ellie asked quickly. The doctor smiled. "For a few minutes." Inside the room, Marianne looked slightly better. Her breathing still sounded heavy, but the oxygen mask helped. Ellie ran to her carefully. "Mommy." Marianne's eyes opened and softened when she saw her daughters. "There you are." Willer climbed onto the chair beside the bed. "We stayed with Colt all night." Marianne looked toward him. "You didn't have to do that." Colt stood quietly near the window. "I wanted to." Marianne studied his face for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "You look different." Colt raised an eyebrow slightly. "Different how?" "Like you're actually here." The words lingered between them. For a long time, Colt had been present in many rooms without truly being there. Meetings, events, conversations. But now, something had shifted. Before he could respond, the nurse entered the room again. "Kids, visiting time is almost over." Ellie sighed softly. "Okay." She hugged her mother carefully. "We'll come back later." Marianne kissed her daughters' foreheads. "Be good." When the girls stepped out into the hallway with Colt, Ellie looked up at him again. "Where are we going now?" Colt thought for a moment. Then he said something that surprised even himself. "You're coming home with me." Ellie blinked. "To your house?" "Yes." Willer's eyes lit up. "Is it big?" Colt smiled faintly. "It's pretty big." Ellie looked uncertain. "But our house is in Queens." Colt nodded slowly. "And it will still be there." He knelt down in front of them. "But until your mom gets better, you're not facing this alone." The girls looked at each other, then back at him. And in that moment, Colt realized something unexpected. The hardest part of this journey wasn't going to be saving Marianne. It was going to be learning how to care for two little girls who suddenly trusted him with their whole world. The girls looked at each other again, unsure but curious, and then Ellie slowly nodded. Willer slipped her small hand into Colt's as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He led them quietly down the hospital hallway, the morning light spilling through the tall windows like a promise that the night had finally passed. Outside, the city had already begun its busy rhythm, but inside the car Colt drove, there was a gentle stillness. The girls watched the passing streets with wide eyes, their reflections faintly dancing in the glass. When the car reached Manhattan and the tall buildings began to rise around them, Willer leaned forward between the seats. "Is your house up there?" she asked, pointing toward the skyline. Colt gave a small smile. "Something like that." When the elevator doors opened into the penthouse, both girls froze. The enormous windows, the polished floors, the quiet elegance of the space, everything felt like another world compared to their small apartment. Willer's mouth fell open. Ellie walked forward slowly, careful with each step as if afraid she might break something just by breathing too loudly. "This is where you live?" Ellie asked softly. Colt nodded. Willer ran to the window and pressed her hands against the glass. "Wow, the whole city is down there." Colt watched them explore the space. 4 years, this penthouse had been a symbol of everything he had worked for: success, control, perfection. But standing there now, watching two little girls laugh and whisper as they discovered the rooms, he realized something strange. The place had always been silent before. Too silent. Ellie eventually turned back toward him. "Where do we sleep?" Colt led them down the hallway to one of the guest rooms. The bed looked enormous compared to their small frames. Willer jumped onto it immediately and bounced once before Ellie gave her a serious look. "We should ask first." Colt chuckled softly. "You can jump." Willer laughed and bounced again while Ellie finally relaxed enough to smile. Later that afternoon, Colt took them to a small store nearby. They chose simple clothes, toothbrushes, and a few toys they didn't dare ask for before. Ellie checked every price tag automatically until Colt gently lowered her hand. "You don't have to worry about that today," he said. She studied him for a moment and then slowly nodded, as if deciding to trust him. Days passed, and a quiet routine formed. Each morning Colt brought the girls to the hospital before work calls began. Marianne grew stronger little by little. The antibiotics started clearing her lungs, and the fever faded. Ellie would sit by the bed reading the storybooks Colt had bought, while Willer colored pictures of flowers and taped them on the wall beside the monitors. One afternoon, Marianne watched Colt helping Willer adjust her blanket. The small gesture made something soften in her eyes. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. Colt leaned against the window. "Yes, I did." She shook her head slightly. "You have a company to run. A life." Colt looked at the girls, laughing softly at something on the hospital TV. "For a long time," he said slowly, "I thought success meant building walls. Bigger houses. Bigger companies. More distance from everyone else." He paused. "But walls keep people out, and they keep you trapped inside." Marianne studied his face carefully, sensing the truth behind his words. The day finally came when the doctor entered the room with a calm smile. "You're strong enough to go home." Ellie and Willer erupted with joy, hugging their mother carefully while Colt stood nearby, watching the moment quietly. When they left the hospital, Marianne expected to return to her apartment in Queens. But as the car turned toward Manhattan, she frowned slightly. "Colt, this isn't the way home." He kept driving until the car stopped outside a familiar building. Rosa was waiting near the entrance, and her eyes widened with relief when she saw Marianne step out of the car. Inside, the girls ran ahead, laughing. Marianne followed them slowly, her breath still careful but steady. When the apartment door opened, she stopped. The place looked different. The furniture had been repaired. Fresh paint brightened the walls. New curtains hung by the windows, and the refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. Marianne turned toward Colt in disbelief. "What did you do?" Colt shrugged lightly. "Just fixed a few things." Ellie ran into the kitchen and shouted with excitement when she saw the shelves filled with groceries. Willer hugged Rosa while pointing proudly at the plants on the windowsill. Marianne's eyes filled with tears. "You paid the debts too, didn't you?" Colt didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "Nobody should lose everything just because they get sick." She looked at him, overwhelmed. "But why?" Colt stepped closer, his voice calm but full of feeling. "Because I finally understood something. Money can build towers, but kindness builds homes." For a moment, the room was silent except for the girls' laughter in the background. Then Marianne did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. Just a quiet, grateful embrace from someone who had carried too much alone for too long. Months later, the small apartment was filled with life again. Marianne had recovered fully. Ellie returned to school with new books, and Willer spent her afternoons drawing pictures of buses, hospitals, and the man who had become their unexpected hero. Colt still ran his company. But something inside him had changed forever. He visited often. Sometimes to help with homework. Sometimes just to sit at the kitchen table and listen to the girls talk about their day. Because in the end, the richest man in the room wasn't the one with the biggest bank account. It was the one who chose compassion when it mattered most. And that was the moment Colt Harland finally understood the truth his success had hidden from him for years. The greatest fortune a person can ever hold is the chance to help someone when they need it most. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing and let us know in the comments which region you're watching from.